Desensitization to media violence. Desensitization is the diminished emotional responsiveness to a negative or aversive stimulus after repeated exposure to it, which means constant exposure to violence can decrease negative effect as violent stimuli lose their effectiveness to trigger strong emotions the more frequently the stimuli is presented. A study had been conducted to examine the links between desensitization to violent media stimuli and habitual media violence exposure as a predictor and aggressive cognitions and behavior as outcome variables. The hypothesis that media violence increases aggressive behavior has been widely studied in experimental research. This research looks at the short-term effects of exposure to violent media stimuli, as well as in cross-sectional and longitudinal studies relating habitual media violence exposure to individual and showing aggressive behavior. The aim of this study is to contribute more evidence on the function of desensitization. There are 4 hypotheses in this study. The first hypothesis is the more media violence is exposed to the individuals in the past, the less increase in physiological arousal they will show when watching a violent film clip compared to other arousing media stimuli such as sad and funny clips. And second, the less anxious and more pleasant they will be. There should be no relationship between habitual media violence exposure and anxious and pleasant arousal towards sad or funny clips. Third, the lower the degree of anxious, the greater the degree of pleasant towards a violent video clip, the higher the tendency of being aggressive. Lastly, lower anxious arousal and higher pleasant arousal towards a violent video clip, but not sad or funny clips, promote higher aggression level. Students enrolled in a broad range of courses at the University of Potsdam in Germany were invited to participate in a 2-part study on emotional responses to films. The first task for the participants was to complete an online questionnaire survey. After that, they were asked to the lab to watch different video clips such as violent, sad, and funny clips and be recorded. Next, they were asked to play games and were asked questions. They were not allowed to drink stimulating drinks like coffee 2 hours prior to the lab session to avoid interfering with the SCL recording. The result showed that as more participants get used to media violence, less physiological reactivity will be shown when watching the violent video clip, supporting the first hypothesis. Like the second hypothesis, there was no relationship of habitual media violence exposure with anxious and pleasant arousal towards sad and funny clips. Lower anxious arousal and higher arousal to violent scenes is not a major factor of aggression, denying the third hypothesis. Highly exposed to media violence participants showed a more positive response than those in low media violence exposure, but media violence exposure did not affect responses to funny films, supporting the fourth hypothesis. The researchers concluded that anxious arousal to the video clip was lower and greater for pleasant arousal among frequent users of media violence than low media violence users. Habitual media violence usage is connected to desensitization of negative and sensitization of positive effect to violent media. Studies are needed to compare passive reception of and active involvement in violent events in the virtual reality of the media in terms of their desensitization potential. The findings explain the processes by which media violence exposure may impact aggression, moving on from the issue of whether or not media violence exposure is linked to aggression.